G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of The Life of Messiah. I pray that it'll be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Last session, we finished off and we saw Jesus was back into Gennesaret, and the people came to him to be healed, and they were touching the tassels of his garments. And that, remember, at this time, healing only comes on the basis of personal faith and personal need. And by touching the tassels of his garments, that was they were demonstrating their personal faith, and they were healed because of their personal need also. Then we saw he gave some instructions regarding the bread of life. In the previous session, he had fed 5,000 men with a couple of loaves and a couple of fish, and I thought that was great. We love this. This is easy food here. And so what we see is that the crowd of 5,000, when Jesus had crossed over the sea, they didn't see how he got there. So the crowd of 5,000 go searching for Jesus, and they now find him, and they're looking for him because they want some more of the same. They want some more food. They want physical food, but Jesus, he offered himself as the Messiah, but they rejected him as Messiah. They rejected the spiritual food, but they want to have the physical benefits from Jesus. But Jesus offers them a new kind of life, and this is eternal life. It's a life of spiritual fullness, and this was, resurrection life. It was eternal and it was heavenly. And he was offering this to the crowds, and it was available to all people. But he said, you need to believe in me. Jesus says, you got to work for eternal life and not for the physical food. You got to work for the spiritual things, not for the physical food, the temporal life. And what was the work that he said they had to do? They had to believe that he was the Messiah. And they says to Jesus, well, what work are you going to do to prove to us? They said, oh, look, Moses gave us manna from heaven. What are you going to do? And then Jesus says to them, he says, listen, I am the bread of life. He said, God gave Moses manna from heaven. Now he's giving the true bread out of heaven, which is the Messiah. And this bread doesn't just fill you up temporary. This bread gives you eternal life. And at this, what did they do? The same thing the Israelites did in the wilderness with Moses. They murmured at what he was saying. So they murmured at this thing that he's talking about, that he was the bread of life, because where he said that he came down out of heaven. Why? Because they knew his human origins. They knew his family, but they did not recognize his heavenly origin. And he says, you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood, and more, and that was the cruncher. Because to them they said, "Oh man, this is crazy," But what was he talking about? He was talking about to eat his flesh and to drink his blood was simply to believe that he is the Messiah sent by God. But this is a very hard saying for many people, and why? Because Jesus said, he says, unless the Father draws them, they'll not understand. And so what happened? From this, we had a departure for many of his disciples. Remember, a disciple is just a learner. He comes along, he's curious about what's going on. But these were the curious ones. They departed. But what it did do was it confirmed the faith of the 11. Because the masses didn't understand what Jesus was saying. They just couldn't grasp it, simply because the Father hadn't drawn them to Jesus. And so with these departing, what we saw was, Jesus says to his 11, well, what about you guys? They said, oh, where are we going to go? You've got the words of eternal life. We'll stick with you, Jesus. And also at this time, we saw this was the time of Judas, the turning of his apostasy. It begins this apostasy here. Now, we looked at also defilement in regard to washing of hands, because, his disciples were eating food without washing hands. And the Pharisees said, whoa, they said, look, you guys are eating food without washing your hands. Now, that's defilement. And Jesus says, hey, that's not defilement. Remember, the Pharisees were big on tradition, the tradition of the elders. That's the oral law, all those rules that they made up themselves. And so they're very big in tradition. One of the traditions was they had to wash their hands up to their elbows before they even ate a little mustard seed. You know, they were stickler for tradition, but not for the written law. Not for the written law. Why? Because we see that they would go out of their way to, with regard to their traditions, they'd go out of their way to keep, they'd go out of their way to keep the tradition, and in doing so, they'd actually break Mosaic law. And one of those areas was with what we call korban, which means dedicated. And the purpose of korban was that, you know, if the Pharisee saw his dad who was walking up the driveway, and, you know, he knew his dad's car's broken down, and he had to, give him some money for it. He says, korban over everything that he had, which means, dedicated. And when dad comes up, he says, I need help. Oh, geez, Dad, I wish you were here 5 minutes earlier, because I've just dedicated everything to God. The Mosaic law said you had to look after your parents. But by doing this, not looking after his parents, what he did was he was actually breaking Mosaic law so he could keep his tradition. And korban meant that he could only use his possessions for private use or give it all to the temple treasury, which they didn't do. And now Jesus says, listen, you guys have made void the word of God because of your traditions. And Jesus says, going back to washing hands, he says, listen, he says, that which enters the mouth doesn't defile a person. It's what comes out of him that defiles a person. And that's why he says, and that's why the Pharisees got very offended at this. And but Jesus said, he says, listen, he says, these guys were not planted by God. And they're going to be uprooted. And that brings us to where we are today. Okay, so we're now he goes up to Tyre and Sidon, and we see this in Matthew 15:21-28. Also, parallel passage, Mark 7:24-30. Now, this is the second withdrawal into the largely Greek-speaking Gentile territory known as Phoenicia, especially the area of Tyre and Sidon. Now, this was the same area that Elijah the prophet was sent by the Lord to a widow at Zarephath. You can read that story in 1 Kings 17, verse 9. And where Jezebel, remember Jezebel had a stash with Elijah. This is where she lived also. Now, Jesus' popularity had spread out even into this area, which today is modern-day Lebanon, and this was a part of the Promised Land, even though Israel actually never obtained it. So Lebanon is part of the Promised Land. Now, the intent of Jesus here is to have a bit of a private time with his disciples, but Mark chapter 7, verse 24 says, and he entered into a house and would have no man know it, and he could not be hid. He's trying to have some private time, but his popularity is so much that he can't get away. In Mark verse 26, we have a woman comes along. Mark calls her a Greek and Syro-Phoenician by race. Matthew simply calls her a Canaanitish woman. She's a Gentile. And the term, and we see that in Matthew 15, verse 22. Now, the term Canaanite was a generic term for a combined number of specific Canaanite tribes. We had the Perizzites, the Hivites, Jebusites, and the Phoenicians were simply a branch of the Canaanites. But by this time, it was a Greek-speaking area and not Canaanite. So she's a Gentile, and that's the key thing to note here. For what happens here, what we're going to see is that when she hears of his presence, she comes to Jesus, and in Matthew 15:22, she says, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil." Now notice here, she's asking for a miracle based on his messianic character, son of David. right? Messianic title. She's calling him, you're the messianic person. You're the son of David. That was the very thing that the Jewish people already had rejected. So she's asking for a miracle based on Jesus' messianic character, which was intended for Israel and not for Gentiles. And on that basis, Jesus didn't respond to her. Now in Matthew verse 23, but he answered her not a word. She's calling to him, he answered nothing. But she keeps on pressing the issue here. So he tells her what the problem is in Matthew 15 verse 24. And Jesus says to her, he says, I was not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he's telling her, you're a Gentile. I was sent by the Father to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to Gentiles. Now, because she was asking on the basis of his messianic character, what she was asking was intended for Israel. And Israel has rejected that. And on that basis, he can do nothing for her. A Messiah can only be a Messiah from Israel and for Israel, not Gentiles. So in verse 26 of Matthew, she changes the basis of her plea. And then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. So now she's not coming on the basis of his messiahship intended for Israel, but on the basis of personal need. Lord, I just need you to help me. But to make certain that she has learned the point, and as well to see if she has faith, in verse 26, Jesus responds by saying, it is not meet, or it's not right, to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. The point here is that it is not proper to take that which was promised to Israel, the Jewish people, and give it unto the Gentiles. And just as food that is intended for the children's portion should not be given to pets and the children go hungry, same thing here. And Mark chapter 7 verse 27 quotes Jesus as saying, let the children first be filled. So let the children of Israel first be filled. Now, the woman's response here shows that she did learn the lesson. And she says in Matthew chapter 15, verse 27, she said, yes, Lord, for even the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. In other words, she's not asking for that which belongs to the children of Israel. No, she was only asking for that which extended to the Gentiles, understanding that even the Jewish covenants had within them promises that certain benefits will extend to the Gentiles. So that's what she's coming on the basis on. I know that the covenants have benefits for us Gentiles as well, and I'm coming on that basis. Because remember, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, which is part of the Abrahamic covenant, not Jesus, but God talking to Abraham, he says, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So she's coming on that basis. I can be a recipient of something of the blessing of the covenants. So she's now showing that she has passed the test and she understands, and she comes on the basis of personal need. Now the miracle comes because of the personal need, and it shows that she has faith. And that point here is made in Matthew verse 28 of Matthew 15. O woman, great is thy faith. Be it done unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was healed from that hour. So on that basis, the answer is yes. And Mark chapter 7 verse 30 says, and she went away unto her house and found the child laid upon the bed and the demon gone out. So the initial response of silence, rejection, and possible insult seemed out of character. The woman passed the test, and she was not deterred in her efforts. She pressed in. Okay. Now, we see him going into Decapolis. We see this in Mark chapter 7, 31, chapter 8, verse 9, and Matthew 15, 29 to 38. In Mark chapter 7, verse 31, Jesus will carefully keep away from the territory of Herod Antipas, because Mark says here, and again he went out from the borders of Tyre and came through Sidon onto the Sea of Galilee, through the midst of the borders of Decapolis. Now, what's Decapolis? Decapolis is it's a union of 10 Greek or Gentile cities, of which only one of them was on the west side of the Jordan, and that was a city called Scythopolis. It was Old Testament Bethshean. So once again, Jesus now comes into Gentile territory, and this is his third withdrawal from the Jewish areas. The last time Jesus came here, it was back in paragraph 68, and that's where he healed that demoniac, remember, who had a legion of demons. And the inhabitants asked Jesus, please, can you leave our territory? Leave us alone. We don't like this here. Now, Jesus is returning to the very same territory. And you remember back then, the man who was delivered from those demons, a Gentile, he wanted to become Jesus' disciple. But at that time, Jesus was not taking Gentile disciples. So what he did was he sent the man back to his city to go and proclaim what Jesus had done for him. And he did so in the cities of Decapolis. And now we're going to see in this paragraph, we're going to see the results of this man's ministry, because it's a booming ministry. And there are two things that we see happen in this paragraph. And one of them is a Jewish thing and one is a Gentile thing. Now, even though this Decapolis is a union of 10 Greek Gentile cities, there was always small Jewish communities within these cities. Now, in Mark's account, in Mark 7, 33 to 37, we see there that the nature and the style of the healing shows us that the individual was a member of one of these small Jewish communities living in a Greek Gentile city, which was not unusual. And now he was coming to Jesus for healing. And here again, we see the same policy of Jesus that has been since paragraph 62 at his rejection. In Mark chapter 7, verse 32, they bring unto Jesus one who was deaf and had an impediment of speech. And the incident here shows that he's dealing with this Jew who was probably brought to Jesus by other Jews. And these ones who brought the deaf man beseech him to heal him by the laying on of hands. So it's these Jews who are suggesting to Jesus how he should heal him. Lay your hands on him and heal him. Now, this man had a twofold problem. He was deaf, and because of being deaf, he also had a speech impediment. Now, there was a Jewish multitude present, and the reason we say this is because we know from his policy in regarding the Jews, he will not do the miracle in public. But we see here in verse, this is with the Jews only, but we see here in verse 33, he took him aside from the multitude privately. So he takes him away privately, somewhere to heal him. Remember, there were no more signs for the general Jewish population until he does respond. Only he responds to personal need on the basis of personal faith. And this is the method now that he uses here. It's a carefully set out method. First of all, what he does, we see in Mark chapter 7, verse 33, he puts his finger in his ears to deal with his deafness. And then Jesus spits. And then thirdly, he uses his own saliva on the tongue of the man with the speech impediment. Again, Mark 7:33. Then he looks up to heaven for the Father's help. And then he sighed, and then he commanded healing by saying, Ephatha, that is, be opened. And the man could both hear and speak. And we see that in Mark 7, verse 35. Notice here that he doesn't always heal in the same way. And again, we can see the continuation of his policy from paragraph 62, and he charged them to tell nobody. He's talking to the Jews here. He says, tell no one. So this signifies to us that this man is a Jew, because this was for Jews only. Don't tell anybody. To the Gentiles, yeah, go and tell everybody. Now, what happened with these Jewish guys? It says they published it all over, resulting in a great multitude coming for healing. Now we come to the second element, which is now recorded by two gospel writers, both Mark and Matthew, or Matthew and Mark, which is now the feeding of the 4,000. Now, there are a lot of similarities with the feeding of the 5,000, but the event it's a different event. The feeding of the 5,000 was a Jewish audience. The feeding of the 4,000 is mostly a Gentile audience. Now, the people that are coming to Jesus are the result of the ministry of the demonized man that was cleansed back in paragraph 68, who went and declared to the cities of the Decapolis, look at me, I'm delivered from those demons. Now, the policy and principles of Jesus that applies to the Jewish audience after paragraph 62 does not apply to the Gentile audience. So whereas Jews were told not to tell anyone, the Gentiles are told to go and share what had happened to them with others. Again, remember, this is all in the area about teaching his disciples. That was the focus. The focus was on teaching the disciples. And he now called unto him his disciples. We see that in Matthew 15:32. And now Jesus wants to make sure that they understand the situation so that they can learn the lesson correctly. And so he said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they continue with me now 3 days and they have nothing to eat. And if I send them away fasting to their home, they will faint on the way, and some of them are come from far. We see this in Mark chapter 8, verses 2 to 3. Now, the apostles inquired, well, Lord, whence shall one be able to fill these men with bread here in a desert place? That's Mark 8, verse 4. This response reveals that they had failed to learn the lesson of the previous feeding of the 5,000, that Jesus can provide in these situations. So focusing on the disciples, he asked them, how many loaves have you? We see it in Matthew 15:34. And they answered 7 and a few small fishes. The number and figures here are different from the feeding of the 5,000. However, as in the previous situation, Jesus now commands the multitude to sit down. He blessed the bread and he continued to break up the food, giving it to his disciples to distribute. And he's starting with the bread and then the fish. We see it in Mark 8, 6-7. And again, same thing. There was enough for everybody to eat until they were full. It says, and they ate and were filled. This is Mark 8, verse 8. Again, leftovers, same as last time. This time we have 7 baskets full. And Mark specified to us here that there were about 4,000. But Matthew noted that the figure only included the men and not the women and children. And that's in Matthew 15:38. And so the actual total figure was much, much higher. The lesson for the apostles was that Jesus can provide in any situation and that the Gentiles would benefit from his ministry. Until after the resurrection, their ministry, the apostles and Jesus' ministry, was restricted or was limited to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, there were already indications from these situations that the Gentiles would profit from Messiah's coming as well. And so they do. Now we're going to see his rejection in Magadan. And here we see it in Matthew 15:39 to Matthew 16, verse 4. Also, parallel passage, Mark 8, 10 to 12. Jesus now sends the multitude away, and he and the disciples now sail back from the Gentile area across back into Jewish territory at Magadan, into Dalmanuta. And this is the Harbor of Magadan, which is the Old Testament Migdol. It's a port on the Sea of Galilee, and it's the home of Mary Magdalene. And so what we see here now is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 1, the Pharisees and the Sadducees came and trying him, asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Both of them are now united in the goal of tempting Jesus, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Remember, they're at the different ends of the spectrum. And they are demanding an authenticating sign so that even after paragraph 62, now and then, they still ask for a sign. But notice how it is qualified here. They said, we want a sign from heaven. Because every time Jesus gives them a sign, where does it come from according to them? It comes from hell, from Beelzebub. Remember, they rejected him on the basis that he was demon-possessed by the prince of demons, Beelzebub. So they attributed all his miracles to Beelzebub. But Jesus again announces here what he said in Matthew chapter 12, his new policy concerning signs, and he also illustrates for them in Matthew 16, verses 2 to 4. When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the heaven is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the heaven is red and lowering. You know how to discern the face of the heaven, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it but the sign of Jonah. And he left them and departed. The Pharisees were well versed in the physical, but not the spiritual. They could discern the weather, but they could not discern the spiritual times. And often the expression, the signs of the times, which we see here in Matthew 16:3, is quite often pulled out of context to try to determine the timing of the rapture or the second coming. However, in this context, it refers to Messiah's first coming, which was carefully timed by Daniel, by Daniel, the statesman Daniel. And we see that in Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27. And Daniel gave a very specific prophecy regarding when the Messiah would come. Now Jesus gives us the same answer that he gave back in paragraph 62, 63 when they rejected him on the basis of demon possession. And he says, for the nation, there will be no more signs except one sign, which is the sign of Jonah, and that is the sign of resurrection. Again, this sign is going to come to Israel on 3 occasions. First, we're going to see him resurrect a man called Lazarus, and then it's going to be the resurrection of Jesus, and then it's going to be the resurrection of the 2 witnesses that we will see in Revelation chapter 11. Now we see here that there is now a warning against rejection. And we see this in Matthew 16, verses 5 to 12, and Mark 8, 13 to 21. So now he's preparing for his 4th departure into Gentile territory. He sets sail again, and Mark says in Mark 8:14 that they forgot to take bread with them, and they only had 1 loaf. And in this context, Jesus is going to warn them about 3 types of leaven. The leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of the Sadducees, both mentioned in Matthew 16, verse 6. And Mark adds in verse 15 of chapter 8, the leaven of Herod or the Herodians. So Jesus warns his disciples about 3 different kinds of leaven. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. Remember, whenever leaven is used symbolically, always a symbol of sin. And within the Gospels, it is a special sin. It is a sin of false doctrine or false teaching. So these 3 groups are spreading a leaven of false doctrine, teaching about Jesus. And they are to be careful not to believe any of the material that they are hearing. All 3 leavens are of a different content. The leaven of the Pharisees is their lie that Jesus is demon-possessed. Now, the Sadducees didn't believe in demons. So the leaven of the Sadducees is that he is against the temple ministry. Remember, the Sadducees control the temple service. They control the money changers and the sellers of sacrifices in the temple compound. And probably this is in light of the fact that, remember, Jesus drove out the money changers during the first Passover of his ministry, and he accused them of turning his father's house into a house of merchandise, and he overthrew their business. So that's the Sadducees. He's against temple ministry. That's the leaven. The leaven of the Herodians is the lie that he is opposed to Roman rule through the house of Herod. Remember, the Herodians are in favor of Roman rule as long as it is through the house of Herod. But you know what? On the contrary here, because Jesus accepted the providence of God in world governmental affairs, and he taught that people should render to Caesar what was Caesar's. So Jesus accepted the fact that Herod is the ruler. We'll see this later on in Matthew 22, verse 21. Now, while he has warned his disciples about accepting these three kinds of leaven, they misinterpret what he's saying, assuming that he's scolding them for not taking enough physical bread with them on the journey. Remember, they only had one loaf of bread. Instead, he wasn't scolding them for that. He was scolding them for not understanding what he was saying. And he says, "O ye of little faith." Matthew 16, verse 8. And in verse 17 of Mark 8, "And Jesus, perceiving it, saith unto them, Why reason ye because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive, neither understand? Have you your heart hardened? Having eyes see ye not, and having ears hear ye not? And do ye not remember?" So he goes on to remind his disciples here, his apostles, of the two major feedings. And in Matthew chapter 16, verses 9 to 10, we have the account of the two feedings, one of 5,000 and the other of 4,000. What these guys should have learned from the two feedings is that Jesus can provide in any and all circumstances. They had not yet learned the lesson from the two feedings that he can provide. He's not fussed about their one loaf of bread. But the point is that they should not be concerned with the lack of physical bread. He'll provide that for them. What they should be concerned with is the false teaching regarding his person and his word. And then finally, in Matthew 16, verse 12, they understood, the penny dropped, they understood that Jesus was not talking about the leaven of physical bread, but the leaven of false teaching, the false doctrine of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. Now we come to the healing of a blind man, and we see this only in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. Now, up to this section in paragraph 81, this has been his fourth journey into Gentile territory. But now we see in Mark 8:22, they come into Bethsaida, or back into Jewish territory. And as a group of people bring to Jesus a blind man. But because of the policy of Jesus since paragraph 62, he will not do miracles for the benefit of the public, not for the Jewish public. So he takes the blind man aside in verse 23 and brought him out of the village away from the crowd. Now, unlike the past where he had healed instantaneously, here Jesus heals the man in two stages instead of immediately. And this is the only miracle in the gospel that he performs in two stages. Now, first of all, Jesus spits on his eyes and then lays hands on him. And that is the first stage. And the man has partial sight in that he can now see, but it's still a bit blurry, because when he sees, he says, I can see men, but they look like trees walking. And we see that in Mark 8, verse 24. Now, in the second stage, Jesus lays his hands on the man's eyes, and then he receives full sight. Now, this is the only miracle performed in these two stages. And now we know that the writers of the Gospels were very selective in what they wrote. And remember, we're looking at this in a thematic approach. And we see the thematic development here, how one event leads to another. So we will see the application of what happens here in the next two paragraphs, paragraph 85 and 86. Because we had a double application here, stage one was the removal of partial blindness, but it also means that they only have partial sight, partially blind, partially sighted. The second stage, you now have the removal of total blindness, and only then do they fully see. And the immediate application would be paragraphs 85 to 86, where we're going to find partial sight and partial blindness. Paragraph 85 will show that the disciples have partial sight, because what Peter says in paragraph 85 will show us that they understood who Jesus was. However, paragraph 86 will show that their sight was blurred because they did not yet fully comprehend God's program of his son's death and resurrection. But for now, they have partial sight because they do not yet fully understand. But by the time of Pentecost, Acts 2, with the coming of the Holy Spirit, they will then have full sight and comprehension, no blindness. Now, we have a wider application here, and this is for Israel. And this is going to be brought out later in the writings of the apostles, particularly Paul, that as a result of Israel's rejection of Jesus as their promised Messiah, a blindness in part has befallen Israel. So they're partially blinded. Israel has become partially hardened as a result of partial blindness. And it is partial because there's always a remnant according to the election of grace. And because it is partial, there will always be Jewish people coming to faith. But eventually, as Paul points out to us in Romans chapter 11, verse 25 to 27, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, then the blindness is removed totally, and then they will fully see, and the result will be that all Israel will be saved. Notice again, Jesus' new policy since the paragraph 62, we see it in Mark 8:26. And he sent him away to his home, saying, do not even enter into the village. In other words, don't go and tell anybody what's taken place. So here's the policy of silence continuing. And now, in Acts chapter 15, verse 14, one of the key purposes of the church age is to call out from among the Gentiles a people for God's name. And this calling will continue until that fullness of the Gentiles come in. And that's from Romans 11:25. And the Greek word for fullness means a full number or a complete number. So in other words, God has set a number of Gentiles that he is destined for faith, destined for salvation. And once that number is reached, the church will be complete and will be removed at the rapture. And then God will turn his eschatological attention back to the nation of Israel. And concerning her salvation, Israel's salvation, he is then going to deal with Israel on a national basis and not only on an individual one. And this national dealing at the end of the tribulation will lead to the salvation of all of Israel. Now we see Peter's confession here. This is Peter the Apostle. And we find this in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Also in Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 30. In Luke chapter 9, verses 18 to 21. So three of the gospel writers have this account. Now we have the confession. And again, remember, we're dealing with this is paragraph 85. We're dealing with partial sight of the disciples here. And several things we need to look at here as background before we go into Peter's actual confession. And the first thing to notice is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, is that this event takes place in a place called Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi. This is not in Jewish territory, but in Gentile territory, and it's north of the Sea of Galilee. Caesarea is also at the foot of Mount Hermon, the highest peak at 9,166 feet. It's the highest peak in the Holy Land. Now, Caesarea is built at the base of a massive cliff rock, and there's a cave at its base, and this massive cliff rock overshadows a town at the southern edge of Mount Hermon. So from this cliff and outward, we now have the town of Caesarea Philippi built. Now, so it's the place back then was filled with natural beauty, and this might actually have been the reason why a shrine to Pan, P-A-N, the god of nature, was established here in a cave. Now, Josephus, a Jewish historian, Josephus, speaking of the cave of Pan, said that it was known colloquially as the entrance to the underworld or the gates of Hades, or the powers of death. The gates of Hades is the power of death. We see this in Matthew 16, verse 18. So Jesus literally took his disciples to the gates of Hades to ask them, who do people say that I am? And here he's going to hear Peter's confession. So in Jesus's day, what we had there was a river that shot forth from this cave of Pan at the base of the cliff rock. And today that river is called Banyas, B-A-N-Y-A-S. It's there in the slide. And it's one of the four sources of the Jordan River. Now, an earthquake about 100 and something years ago changed its course, and today it comes out to the right of this cave. And back in Jesus' day, as this shoots out of this cliff rock, it breaks off little stones and little pebbles from off the massive cliff face. And the stream here is full of, or the river here is full of these little stones and pebbles that were broken off from the cliff rock where the water just shot out. And the Greek word for pebbles and small stones is petros, while the cliff itself is called Petra. We'll see on the next slide. Now, Jesus is going to say a number of things that relate directly at the geography of the immediate area. So we need to understand these terms here. In paragraph 83, 2 paragraphs back, Jesus warned them about 3 types of leaven in Matthew 16:6 and Mark 8:15. And in this section, he now tested them to see if they had learned the lesson. It is a test of the disciples in light of the teaching about him from the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. And this particular exam is only a 2-question exam, only 2 questions. Question number 1, we find in Matthew 16, verse 13. And the question is, Jesus talking, he says, who do men say that the Son of Man is? This is very similar to Mark 8:15. Now, the apostles give several answers or views as to who the masses say that Jesus is. Some say John the Baptist. By now, John has been executed. And some people think that he's John who's been raised from the dead. Others say Jeremiah because of the similarity of the weeping prophet. Others say Elijah, fulfilling Malachi 4. And others say that he could be one of the other prophets besides these 3 already spoken about here. But what is obvious from the masses is that they do recognize his supernatural authority, but they fail to conclude accurately his person. He is the messianic person, the king. That doesn't seem to be one of the options that the people are going with. Now, in Matthew 16, verse 15, second question, he said unto them, the disciples, but who say you that I am? Now, the way we read it here, it just seems pretty ordinary. But in the Greek, it is far more emphatic. It reads, but you guys, who do you say that I am? In contrast to what everyone else is saying, what do you believe about me? What do you believe? Now in verse 16, Peter, speaking on behalf of the others, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Here again, the Greek is very emphatic. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living one. And what it shows to us here is that they learned the lesson. They understood who he is, and the test is passed. He has heeded the warning against rejection to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. But having passed the test, Jesus now lays some points before the apostles, particularly focusing on Peter. We have 5 statements about Peter. Now, in response to Peter's declaration, Jesus tells him several things, 5 of which require careful examination. Now, Matthew alone records these additional statements. Why? Because Matthew is writing to Jews, and he in particular traces the consequences of the unpardonable sin. The others don't. Now, first up, we see the source of Peter's knowledge. Jesus first declared, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. Matthew 16, verse 17. Jesus is saying that Peter's conclusion was not deducted from human logic. It was the result of divine illumination by God the Father. Jesus tells him several things, but Now, what we see here is this, just regarding this source of Peter's knowledge here. 2 observations. First of all, Peter's name, Bar-Jonah. According to John 1, verse 42 and John 21, verse 15, his father's name was John, not Jonah. Now, this is not an error on Matthew's part. Son simply means to display the characteristic of or being a follower or disciple of, as in the sons of the prophets, for instance. Now, we know that Jonah was a prophetic voice of God's message. So is Peter, because Peter is a proclaimer of the truth about Jesus. As Jonah was a prophet to the Ninevites, Peter was the apostle who helped to open the door of the gospel to the Gentiles. And that's, you can find it in Acts chapter 10. Jonah's success wasn't a result of his preaching skills, but it was by divine power. And Peter's confession here was not a result of his own spiritual insights, not flesh and blood, but my Father who is in heaven. The second thing that we see here is that the phrase flesh and blood, that's a very common rabbinic expression which differentiates man from God. Peter's conclusion was not deduced from human logic, wasn't deduced from man. It was a result of divine illumination by God the Father. Now, let me just quickly go back here just to the other things, the other statements regarding Peter. He says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I'll give unto you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay, so that's the 5 statements about Peter. Now Jesus' second declaration to Peter is Matthew 18, verse 6, is Matthew verse 18 of Matthew 16. Matthew 16, 18. I'm tired. And I also say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, this is a favorite verse of Catholicism that teaches that the church was built upon Peter, and they conclude that Peter was the first pope, and by means of papal succession, all of the popes were the true representatives of God, having received authority from pope to pope from Peter's line. So as a result, the Roman Catholic Church is the one and only true church. 3 things regarding this belief. First of all, Peter had never been to Rome, nor was he ever Bishop of Rome. A apostolic succession is a contradiction, because to be one of the apostles, you had to have been with Jesus from the start of his ministry and had been an eyewitness of his resurrection. And there's no evidence that Jesus or the other apostles regarded Peter as infallible. In fact, Jesus rebukes Peter in the strongest terms, and so did Paul in the dispute about the Gentiles, which we find in Galatians 2:11. So when they define this to be the meaning of Matthew 16 verse 18, what they're basically saying is that Matthew, who wrote the event, did not know some very simple rules of Greek grammar. And the simple rules of Greek grammar are that a masculine modifies a masculine and a feminine modifies a feminine. A neuter modifies a neuter. That's grammar. What you cannot have in Greek grammar is a feminine modifying a masculine or vice versa. That is not the way the Greek grammar works. So when Jesus says, you are Peter, he's using the Greek word. He says, you are Petros. Petros is a masculine noun, and it means a small stone or pebble. So what Jesus is saying to Peter is, Peter, you are a small stone or pebble, just like these small stones or pebbles in this stream of Banyas. And when he goes on to say, upon this rock I will build my church, he uses a different Greek word, which is Petra, P-E-T-R-A, which is a feminine noun, and Petra means a massive cliff rock, just like the one that was overshadowing them at that point at Caesarea Philippi. So grammatically, it cannot possibly mean that the church is being built upon Peter. In fact, it's the opposite. Jesus is contrasting Peter, Petros, small pebble, with this massive cliff face. He was also presupposing that the disciples were familiar with a very old, important Old Testament symbol, because whenever the word rock is used symbolically in Scripture, it is always a symbol of the Messiah throughout the Old Testament. And you can find it in Isaiah 28, verse 16. So the church is not being built upon Peter, but upon the Messiah, more specifically, what Peter just said about the Messiah. You are the Messiah, the Son of the God, the living one. And it is on this confession of Peter that the church is now being built. Peter, you're a rock. You're a small one. But your words are a big rock, and they're going to be the foundation for my movement from now on. I will build my church. Notice Jesus says here, I will build my church. It's future tense. And this is the first time that the term church is used in the New Testament. In Greek, it's ekklesia, and in Hebrew, it's kahila. And it is only used in Matthew chapter 16 and Matthew 18. None of the other gospel writers speak of the church at all. Matthew was the only writer who traced the results of the unpardonable sin, one of which was this new entity called the church. And this contradicts the common teaching of replacement theologians that the church has existed since the beginning of time. Jesus did not view the church as already being in existence, but rather that he would build it at a future time. So here in Matthew 16 here, the church is still future. It hadn't begun as yet. Now, Jesus and the disciples spoke in Hebrew and not in Greek, and the Hebrew equivalent for Petros is Evan, masculine singular noun. Petra is Sella, feminine singular noun. Two very different words. That's it on the screen there for you to look at. Now we have the gates of Hades. Now, Jesus makes a third point in verse 18 of Matthew. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now, another reason that the surroundings are important in understanding Jesus' words is that they were standing at what was known in the pagan world as the gates of Hades, the place which we just spoke about known as Banyas today. In the Hebrew scriptures, the term, the gates of Hades, was an idiom for physical death. And you can find this in in Job 38, verse 17, Psalm 9:13, Psalm 107, verse 18, and in Isaiah 38, verse 10. And since it is by physical death that one enters into Sheol or Hades, that's why they call it, that's why, the gates of Hades. You enter through the gates into the area where you're dead, Now, upon the rock, meaning the content of Peter's confession, Jesus would build his church, and physical death could not destroy it. Neither his death, nor the deaths of the apostles, nor the deaths of countless martyrs throughout the history of the church. And keep in mind here that Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, it speaks about that the church was built upon the foundations, or the foundation of the New Testament apostles and prophets, with the Messiah being the chief cornerstone. So neither Jesus' death nor the apostles' deaths would destroy what was to be built, the church. And that is as far as we do today. Thank you very much for coming along. We will continue with this next session. Okay.